So as you were saying, the neighborhood watch does have an impact on the child's environment and the child's life indirectly, but it's not some element or part of the environment that the child has any connection with on a regular or even not regular basis. And that is the ecosystem. So the ecosystem can have a positive and be a protective factor for us, or it can be a negative or a risk factor for us. We're now going to be moving on to the macro system. And the macro system really refers to we can call it the dominant social and economic structure that the textbook refers to. That's the Barriers to Learning textbook, the chapter that we've uploaded. And it includes things such as the culture in which we live, the beliefs, and these elements, such also like the mass media, these influence where we get our understanding of the world. These influence the way we think, our attitudes, how we implement structures in our life. For example, the current generation or the culture that we have is that we have a lot of dependence on technology. And so that affects the way we see the world. It affects the way our patience, it affects the way we consider things to have value. And so it's a very specific level of the environment. And it can affect the other interactions within the environment as well. So if, for example, the culture at the time is to value empowerment, empowerment will then filter down into the various elements of your system. It will come out at the school level, at the peers level, in legal services, mass media, all other systems will be impacted as well. And so that macro system really has a great impact on the individual, but filtering down through the systems. I'd like to read you a very short part of the textbook, the Addressing Barriers to Learning, the chapter that has been copied for you. And it says about the macro system: the very principle of inclusion falls within the ideologies of the macro system. And for it to become part of school cultures and systems, it should be embraced by all in the macro system. So within that, with all within the micro system. So that's the family, health services, the church, the neighborhood, the schools, peers, etc. And for it to become part of school culture, as I say, it must be embraced by all in the microsystem, including the professional services, the classroom systems, families, and the individual child. So that is something that we need to keep in mind as well. Like I said earlier, inclusive education is not just a module or standalone on its own. It needs to be integrated and woven into the fabric of our communities and societies. So the Chrono System is about the impact made over time. So it gets a little confusing here, but the Chrono System talks about how time affects the individual in different ways. So an example would be, depending on the time period that you live, that will affect you as an individual. So people that are living today, as with the previous example I used, technology is a greater part of our environment and society, as opposed to 40 or 50 years ago, where technology was not quite as prevalent. We were not as dependent on technology as we are today. So that period of time, the time period in which you live, affects you as an individual, because you are very distinct from the generations that were before you. The Chrono System also refers to the interactions of the levels over time. How, for example, and this is a very basic example, how, for example, mass media influences the family to such an extent that the family adopts these beliefs from mass media, and this then obviously filters to the individual and child. So that is what a very brief understanding of the Chrono System. I think it's important for you to do some reading and also read over the chapter, the Addressing Barriers to Learning chapter, with the editors. The editors are Landsberg and the assistant editors are Kruger and Swart. They will help you to, it will really help you to understand the Chrono System in more detail. So that is the biological model. So why is it important? It's important because it's a framework within which we can understand children, both in this course and many other courses that you'll be doing, like educational psychology. The biological model will be focusing on it, and will be quite prominent in the literature because it does fit into the way we understand development and growth within children. It has a huge impact on children. So for example, in previous theorists have focused on one part of the child, the brain, the stages of development, etc., what the stages and the milestones a person must achieve and go through to go to the next level. Bronfenbrenner looks at the individual, yes, but he also very importantly says, look at the systems that affect that individual. Because you, as a child, you could have an aptitude, for example, let's say you would have an aptitude for reading, but your environment never encourages reading. Actually, it discourages reading. And this is a very basic example. That system, that environmental system, your family, your school, whoever is discouraging, this is a very, very silly example, but the system that is discouraging you from reading is actually opposed to your natural aptitude. And therefore, we can say that the systems within which you live are having a great impact on you. So we're not only looking at the individual, we're also looking at everything that comes together to impact you. That includes politics, that includes the laws of the country, that includes the economic situation of the country. Whether we know it or not, there is a thread that goes from us to every other element in society. The fact that I used an example earlier about poor nutrition, especially in lower socioeconomic areas. So if the child comes from a lower socioeconomic area, the family does not have access to organic or healthy meals and good health services. And therefore, because of this, they are affected by the financial situation, which we would say falls within the macro system. So that is how we can see how every system somehow will trickle down to affect the individual. A last word on this, please do your research, please learn about this system, think of how to make it more real for you, try to apply it into your own life. How do you feel that the biologic model can be applicable to your life? So when we look at approaches, and we're just moving a little bit away from the biological model, when we're looking at the approaches as we discussed earlier, and also if we take into consideration the biological model actually, we can look at traditional approaches and we can look at inclusionary approaches. And the change in society, which is the change in the political climate, the change in the way we view people and we view our environments as is true, as we spoke about a minute ago, in the macro system. These all affect what's going to be happening in the classroom. So look at the traditional approach, look at the inclusionary approach. I put this here for you just as a quick guide on the differences between the two. And I think that this is just an interesting little snapshot for you and to be kept as a resource for you for future. So what do we have to do to include every child? What is a starting point? We have to ensure that inclusive education and inclusive practices are part of our training programs as they are for you. Make sure that there's an integration of inclusive education into every course and every part of the teacher training process, because this helps to raise awareness. And we as teachers that are within this field right now, learning in this field right now, we can go into our spaces where perhaps your teachers that have been there for years that may not be as clued up on inclusive education as we are. Because understanding inclusive education will allow you to know about things such as assistive devices. We'll talk about that in the next slide. Assistive devices will help students to navigate the classroom space and allow them to be part of the learning the same as any other learner. Teachers should also be trained on how to include learners in a meaningful and natural way. So oftentimes we improvise, which is brilliant. We try to include children that are not necessarily able to do the same as their peers. And so we give them other activities to do. But sometimes teachers, and this is no fault of anybody, but they may not be trained to know how to provide activities that are going to stimulate the child and that are going to help them to learn meaningful content. And so it's important for us as teachers and young teachers and teachers in training, and when I say young, I mean young as in years of experience in the teaching field, we need to learn how to access the tools that helps us to provide stimulation for all learners. Also, though we believe that we should educate learners that have differences, we should also be hiring teachers with differences that have their own barriers to learning. And not just in teaching, in every part of our environment, in every workforce, we should have people with different abilities being considered for a position without their difference or their learning barrier being the biggest stumbling block that you see. They shouldn't be hired just because they have a barrier. Ideally, in years to come, although today we are trying to include more people with learning differences and barriers into communities. Apologies, into companies because because we want to make a change. But it should be in future. A person should be employed for what they bring to the company rather than whether they are able-bodied or not. Okay, and then also we need to build relationship with parents and community members because we need to spread awareness. Also, we have to be researching, workshopping, training, reading up on the different learning abilities, what we can expect to see in our classroom, how we can accommodate those learners, how we can be there in a meaningful way for our learners and make them feel part of the class, and how all of this research, workshops, and training will help us to build resources, will help us to point out the need for infrastructure to support initiatives of this nature that are going to help us to create a better learning environment for people with different learning abilities. And then I want to end of this slide. We'll move on to the next one in a minute. I'll end up with this point on listening to the child. Oftentimes we go around looking at how can we help this child? What can we do? What does this child need? But we don't ask the child. The child is the person that has the most information about their own needs. They can best tell you, you know what, I don't learn very well if you're going to do that. I can't listen if you're shouting. Sometimes listening to the child means that we don't really hear it's not necessarily about what they say. Is a big part of what they say, but it's not just about what they say. It's also about the way they react. If you notice a child is naturally drawn toward coloring and drawing, then that gives you an indication that color and expression in that way is part of the learning process. If you see, for example, a child does not like to work in a group, or a child likes to work with their hands, listen to them, listen to the behavior. That gives you an indication of how to work with your child. And many of you, all of us have done it. We've seen non-verbal communication and we've understood it. So if you have a guest coming over and you set out the tea on the table, and this guest that you have a couple of times a month, you notice that they don't put sugar in their tea. Even though they did not say they don't put sugar in their tea, you are listening to their non-verbal communication by them not putting sugar in their tea, and therefore you know what their preference is. This is exactly the same concept with a child. Listen to them through their behavior, through their interactions, because their behavior is not just negative, it's also teaching us something as well. So there's a lot of assistive technology, such as, if we're going to look first at, I'm going to look at physical mobility because it's easier for us to talk about. It's something we can see more. So it's things like ramps, opening doors, because sometimes people are not able to open doors, and so the automatic door opening, scooters, grab bars, especially in public washrooms, having grab bars is important. Assistive technology includes things like wheelchairs, handheld GPS units, automatic doors, wider doorways, and adapted car seats. I'm going to move over to the first one now. The areas of improvement addressed by assistive technology. So these are the areas that can really help people. And so it's things like we can help people with reading. And so that can be screen readers. Those can be things like text-to-speech, screen magnifiers, and so on and so forth. Writing as well. Text-to-speech will be connected to writing. So text-to-speech is obviously speaking, and then your words then get typed out onto your computer. So there's various elements and various possibilities and assistive technology that can actually help a child to progress in their learning environment. They can be expensive and it's not always easy to access, but it does exist. and it's something that